Remember when you could build only 3 forts at a time? Yeah, good times. Now you can just select every city and start building forts in each one of them. This is all thanks to this new update, which I'm going to discuss today, because it's disrupted the entire game balance by a lot, namely in defense. I understand it's hard to balance defense and attacking, but holy shit, this update just almost completely killed static lines and made specialization and maneuver warfare so overpowered. Let's go over what the update did first. Each country now gains one free choice per branch of doctrines, one aerial, one naval, and one land doctrine, which is amazing. This was one of the things I was asking for. You can now pick a leader and a doctrine, so you don't have to choose anymore. But this is not the reason why the game has changed so much. This is actually one of the good things about this update. Everything else, not so much. Forts no longer have a limit on how many you can build at a time. Before it was 3, now you can just select all cities and build forts on all of them. I'm not really a fan of this, mainly because you can just spam this, and forts aren't that expensive to begin with. This will just further incentivize defense rather than offense, which is just going to make the games a slogfest. Forts increase resistance, so it just takes longer and requires more units to take over a city. I would be okay with allowing you to spam forts if they were expensive, but right now they're just too cheap to upkeep. You're basically invading someone with double the population if they spammed forts. I would have preferred if this was not in public servers, but an option you could toggle in private servers, because that's the place I see people spam forts the most. Just to illustrate how overpowered this is, imagine if Germany is going to invade Russia in the coming months, and it's pretty early in the game. They just have max doctrines and some research. It takes 50 days to build forts, and boom, you now have an impenetrable fortress. You can now also spam infantry that are specialized, because why not? There's literally no counter to this, except the expensive bombers that can be easily shot down with fighters. I don't understand why Hyperant is buffing or adding more boring stalemates, because nothing will be moving in the current state of the game. Forts are a very good idea if there are counters and they are properly balanced, which they are not. Forts, first of all, needs to take a long time to build. They need to be a commitment. In games like Hearts of Iron 4, forts take away precious building time from other things, like factories. In Rise of Nations, it's hard to implement this, since you can just build something God knows where, and this small populated city will have the same industrial power as Moscow. Somehow. Before, building 3 forts at a time was kinda a good way of commitment. You wasted so much time just building the forts that you were losing in everything else, but I can understand why this would be tedious and annoying. A way to implement commitment in another way is to make forts really expensive and take a long time to build. I'm thinking 1 year minimum. That way you leave yourself vulnerable during the building time to attacks, and you will be forced to give up your building on tanks if you plan on placing a fort on your square cities. Forts also needs to be very expensive. They should first of all have a very high upkeep cost when there's no troops on a fort. You should only really be able to afford forts on the cities on the border. Then, there should be another upkeep cost that scales depending on how many troops are on a fort. This will discourage people camping on forts. But there also needs to be counters to forts, if they are to remain this OP. There needs to be doctrines that gives extra damage against fortified units, leaders that gives extra attack to forts, operations that allow you to bust fortifications, and the one idea I like very much is that artillery should be able to destroy forts. It's pretty frustrating how Hyperant hasn't added anything to really counter forts, and he just keeps buffing defense. Let's go over the biggest change though. The doctrines. The reduced stalwart defense war exhaustion from I believe it was 0.008 to 0.005 is not the reason why static lines has gotten almost worthless. It's the buff to specialization down here in their starting experience. One of my main complaints of specialization was that the training only provided you with a 6-minute buff in training. This was because of this training cap that you can only train your troops to 75%. So, after a person with no doctrine trained their units for 6 minutes, they would have almost equal strength to your specialized unit. Welp, now specialization starts with troops trained to 94, 19 above the training cap limit. But Amandus, I hear you say, how does this destroy static lines? Well, here's how it destroys static lines. 60,000 specialized infantry units with anti-tank 2 can defeat 800 Steel Division tanks. 100,000 non-trained static lines units with anti-tank 2 gets killed by 800 Steel Division tanks, by a lot. If you were using static lines early game to beat tanks, well, it's time to stop now. Specialization is just clearly better this way, without any training. But even when static lines are fully trained, specialization beats it in terms of losses. Static lines is only better than specialization by a tiny margin when they are fighting each other, with no terrain or biome affecting the units. But if they are both being supported by Daddy USA and Daddy Russia in terms of manpower, well, specialization will just decimate static lines. Static lines is therefore worse than specialization at beating tanks, but it beats specialization if they are fighting each other. This is a weird circle. However, this is without accounting for what this update really did that buffed specialization to oblivion. It was the biome damage increase from 1.35 times to 2 times. What? Yeah, this is why defense just got absolutely OP. If you are inside any biome and have selected that specific buff for your specialized units, well, your infantry units are now on drugs. Couple this with that you can now also spam forts, and you will basically have multiple impenetrable fortresses around the world. I'm thinking the DRC, Iran, Colombia, any mountainous country, and so on. I know this is very limited, however, since it's only one biome, but that single biome still extends far and wide, like in Africa. Just being immortal in this area and still being able to fight back against tanks better than static lines in areas not with your selected biome is enough. You can also just camp inside your preferred biome and then just spam nukes. That's exactly why I've come to hate Iran players. I'm sorry, I have nothing against you, it's just the way you play. I hope you get cursed with forever warm pillows. If you're still insistent on picking static lines, remember that maneuver warfare also got buffed by a lot. So I don't see why you would pick the inferior doctrine at killing tanks, now that tanks are stronger than ever. But there's the small case where you are using static lines as an offensive doctrine. But why? Maneuver warfare is just better at invading, and specialization is just better at defending. Static lines is kinda stuck in this weird limbo, where it's not completely useless, but everything else is just better. At least the doctrines are being reworked, so that's cool to see. Hyperant just needs to find the balance between static lines and specialization, where they both don't collide with each other on what they do. Also, maybe buff massed attack, it's still dead. Even I almost forgot it existed for a second. There are some nations like the Persian Empire that gives a modifier of extra infantry starting experience. This also applies to the Roman Empire. So, if we just build some infantry units, we'll see in a bit just how big of a starting experience boost they get. 242 out of 300, and they're starting with that. Look at this, more 25% extra starting experience. If you're playing as the Persian Empire, GG, you've beat the game. You can quit now. Yeah, if you're not using maneuver warfare early game for invasions, and then specialization late game for defending, I don't know what you're doing. It's so absolutely broken right now. Specialization is so stupidly broken. If you're not using it, I don't know what you're doing, dude. Hyperant, please, this was too much of a buff.